All right, this is the second part of the video entitled Induction and Intuition. Picking it up here, the remainder of this is going to be why induction is not sufficient to get you knowledge of first principles. All right, so that's where the last video left off. That's where this one begins. So we're going to go to the text of Aristotle now. All right, so Aristotle says, towards the end of chapter 19, in fact, at the very end of chapter 19, thus it is clear that we must get to know the primary premises by induction. For the method by which even sense perception implants the universal is inductive. So induction is how we get from sense perception to the universal. But it's not going to be the whole story. He draws the following contrast. He says, now, of the thinking states by which we grasp truth, some are unfailingly true. Others admit of error, opinion, for instance, and calculation, whereas scientific knowing and intuition are always true. What seems to be going on here, and this I want to point out to you, is a matter of scholarly dispute. I'm going to be presenting a view about what Aristotle's saying that, or I'm only presenting a particular view about what Aristotle's saying here. There are people who disagree with what I'm about to tell you as an account of what Aristotle thinks. I'm not going to get into the interpretive issue because at the end of the day, what Aristotle thinks isn't what actually interests me. It's the fact that Aristotle is introducing the idea that perception and induction are necessary for all knowledge, but he doesn't think they're sufficient for any knowledge. Or rather, he doesn't think they're sufficient for scientific knowledge or episteme. Why? Well, it's because induction isn't unfailingly true, or the results of induction aren't unfailingly true. So this goes back to that issue Plato would have had. Plato would have said, how do you know you're sorting the things correctly? How do you know you're getting good concepts? Because if you have bad concepts, you're going to end up with false universal claims. Right? So to use the example again, let's say you categorized whales with fish. And you said fish include all the animals with fins that live primarily in the water, right? Things like that. Well, then you would be led to the following universal claims. Not all fish are cold-blooded. Not all fish lay eggs. And these universal claims would be false. I keep using the whales-fish example, by the way, because to my knowledge, Aristotle's the first person to actually figure out that whales weren't fish, or to figure out that there was good reason to categorize them differently than fish. So, you're going to get false universal claims if you have bad concepts. It seems like we can develop bad concepts, right? It seems as though we can categorize things incorrectly. For a very long time, everybody thought that planets were stars, were the same thing as stars. In fact, planet in Greek, or planet comes from the Greek for wandering star. Planets were just stars that didn't behave normally. And it helped us figure out what was going on with planets and their motion, to figure out that they were much closer than stars. Right, that there were ways you could magnify images of planets so that it was clear that they were like Mars and Venus and Jupiter and things like that, and that the same thing couldn't happen with stars. No matter how much you magnified them, you were still left with just like a big ball of light. Figuring out that the planets were different than the other stars in the sky helped us do astronomy. For a long time, we had the wrong categorization. So how do you make sure that your inductions are correct? This is the issue that seems to be bothering Aristotle, but there's another issue. The other issue is you could have the right concepts, but just not have enough perceptual data. It's not clear that Aristotle's aware of this problem, but I'll use the standard example. If you have been looking at swans, I'm going to try to draw a swan. This is almost certainly a mistake. Wing and the rest of the body, and there's the, there it's a swan, la-di-da-di-da, right? This is a terrible drawing. If you've seen a bunch of swans, one after another, you might come to the conclusion that all swans are white. every swan you've seen is white. Let's say you've seen hundreds and hundreds of swans. You could come to the conclusion, all swans are white, that's a universal claim. You could come to this conclusion while properly sorting things together. Let's say you've got the right concept of swan. Everything that you've seen that you've put into the category swan is a swan, and you don't have any other things in there, right? You don't have any very large ducks in your set of objects that you remembered, that you grouped together under the concept swan. So you've avoided the mistake that probably would have worried people like Plato and Aristotle more. But there's another mistake that you could be making, which is you haven't seen enough swans to find out that there are black swans, because black swans are comparatively rare. And so by not having seen enough swans, or by not having pursued observations of swans in like a wide enough range of environments, right, you could come to the false conclusion by induction that all swans are white. But there are black swans, so it seems like induction can give the wrong answer. So there's at least two issues here, one of which Aristotle, I think, was very clearly aware of, which is that you can come to have bad concepts by this process of induction, and that can lead to false universal claims, being claims you believe. And another issue, which you would think Aristotle would be aware of, but I don't know of anywhere that his awareness of this problem shows up in the text, and that's just that with induction, more information always holds out the possibility of undoing the regularity you've noticed. We'll talk about this a lot more when we get to David Hume. But Aristotle does seem to be aware that induction can always lead to false beliefs about universals. It's important, it's necessary and vital to the process of getting scientific knowledge, because it's induction that allows us to have beliefs about universals at all. The only thing that allows us to even understand universal claims is induction, because it's by induction that we get the concepts out of which universal claims are built. But there's something extra that's needed to have genuine knowledge, and that is nous. Nous is the Greek word. Nous is a word about which there's a lot of contested translation. In the translation I've given you, nous is being translated as intuition. So induction gets you to the point where you have universal beliefs, beliefs about universals. Beliefs that, like, everything in one category or that falls under one concept also falls under another. So in the case example I used, all giraffes, everything that falls under the concept of giraffe also falls under the concept of quadruped. Right? Induction is what allows us to get to that point. But to know that it's true requires more than induction. It requires intuition. What's intuition? Well, according to Aristotle, it's a kind of sense. It's like we'll call it mental sight. But sight here is not important. It's a mental sense. So we'll change sight to sense. We have a tendency to overstate the importance of sight among our senses. Philosophers are always using sight as the example, but what's important here is that it's a sense. It's a way of taking in information. So why do we need this? Well, Aristotle thinks the only way to be sure that your universal claims are true is either by deducing them from other universal claims, that's demonstration. But, like he said, not every universal claim can be known by demonstration. The fundamental beliefs, the founding or first principles, can't be known by demonstration. We can come to be familiar with them. We can come to believe them, these first principles, by induction. But in order to know that they're correct, there has to be some way that the false ones, the false universal claims that we come to believe by induction, get weeded out. And this would require some kind of contact, Aristotle thinks, with the universals themselves. We have to take in information about the universals themselves. But the senses, which are how we take in universals, or how we take in information rather, can't give us information about universals. The physical senses can't. So Aristotle basically says there has to be some kind of mental sense, which can be activated when you come to have the universal belief. That's what induction does. And then it's like the light bulb goes off or it doesn't. Right? Either you've done the induction and gotten to the correct answer, something like all giraffes are quadrupeds, or all fish lay eggs, or you haven't, and you come to some belief like all swans are white, or not all fish lay eggs, or some fish don't lay eggs, right? That would be if you miscategorized whales. Nous is what's going to make the difference. Right? Nous is going to, that sort of aha moment, when everything clicks into place. Right? Nous is going to play a vital role in making it the case that you know, rather than just believe, the first principles. So there are three routes to knowledge. There's induction. Induction by itself can't give you knowledge. Right? There's deduction, of which demonstration is a kind. Demonstration by itself can't give you knowledge because you have to know the first principles by some other method than deduction. And if you don't know the first principles, no amount of demonstration is going to help. And then there's intuition. Now you might wonder, why does intuition not just work on its own? Why can't, if we have this sort of mental sense, if there's some part of our mind that can reach out and in a sense get in touch with the universals, the universal truths, the same way sight and hearing and taste and smell and touch can bring us into contact with the physical particulars, why can't intuition do the job by itself? Why can't we just intuit everything? Well, as for why we can't, I'm not sure Aristotle has much of an answer. But Aristotle thinks there's really good evidence that we don't. Why? Well, if we've had the mental sense all our lives and the mental sense could do it all by itself, then we would have the knowledge earlier. For Aristotle, it's really important that we go through a developmental process, that we actually observe that people, as they grow, go through a developmental process. They start out with no scientific knowledge and they come to have it. Induction is supposed to be a model of how that happens. So Aristotle just thinks we know that we don't have it right from the beginning. We know, therefore, that some process like induction must be going on, a process that takes time, that takes repeated instances of perception. Okay. We know also that people can go wrong, so this process can't be a process that's infallible. We also know that in order to have genuine scientific knowledge, we need more than induction. It can't be deduction. Deduction's not going to be of any help. So we have to have intuition. But intuition can't give us concepts all by itself, right? We don't get our concept of giraffe from intuition. We get our concept of giraffe from induction. Intuition is going to be what allows us to be sure that the concepts we've developed and the universal truths we've sort of built up out of those concepts are correct. So we have induction, deduction, and intuition. Whereas for Plato, there was only ever deduction. And Plato got around needing induction or intuition by saying, well, we're born with true opinions. And repeated use of the Socratic method, which is, you can think of it in a way as a bunch of deductions, one after the other, right? Where you show conflicts between your beliefs and things like that, and you slowly whittle away your beliefs until you've gotten rid of all the false ones. Repeated use of the Socratic method just allows us to have the first principles because we always had true opinions about the first principles, and the Socratic method reveals what those are. And then we deduce everything from them. Right? But for Aristotle, because he doesn't believe in innate true opinion, there have to be these things, induction and intuition. And it's in particular induction and the role that induction gives to perception in knowledge. That's the really groundbreaking thing here. Because what we're seeing, and I'm going to finish up the video real soon here, what we're seeing is Aristotle basically coming up with a view in contrast to Plato's called empiricism. Wasn't called that by Aristotle. Wasn't called that by Plato. So there's empiricism and rationalism. Plato was a rationalist. The key difference between rationalism and empiricism is the role that it gives to perception and knowledge. According to Plato, perception, sense perception, doesn't seem to play any role in justifying our knowledge. Because it's not through sense perception that we get any of the information. We're born with the information. And it's an entirely sort of internal to your mind process to go from having the information to having the knowledge. For Aristotle, if we couldn't perceive things, if we didn't have sense perception, we couldn't know anything. All knowledge requires sense perception because all knowledge is either a deduction, or demonstration rather, from the first principles, in which case you need to know the first principles, or it's knowledge of first principles, and that requires perception. And in that way, all knowledge originates with perception. And this can seem like a kind of dry distinction, right? But it actually gets at something vital to understanding knowledge, because if you're an empiricist, it seems like the range of things you can have knowledge about is very limited, or it's limited in a way that it's not for rationalists. For an empiricist, if something can't be perceived, if there are no particulars about which we can have perceptions, then it seems like knowledge can't even get started, because the induction has to happen before the intuition, which happens before the demonstration. The perception and induction is the root of it all. So if there are no physical particulars for us to have sense perceptions about, it seems like the process of getting knowledge can't get started, which means we can't have knowledge of anything except for particular physical things and universal categories, or like the concepts of those particular things. And this is going to make a big difference for what you can know about, for example, moral truths or mathematics or religious entities. Right? And this distinction between rationalism and empiricism, with Plato the rationalist and Aristotle the empiricist, is going to play a huge role throughout the rest of philosophy. Now, Aristotle is only a partial empiricist, for reasons I'm not going to explain here. I'll just say the account Aristotle gives of knowledge in the Posterior Analytics gets expanded upon in later books. He wrote like the Metaphysics, where there do seem to be other routes to knowledge besides just perception. But in order to present both his views in this book and a cleaner view than the one he actually ended up having, we're just going to focus on what he says here. Like I've said a bunch of times, I don't particularly care what Plato and Aristotle think. What's important is the ideas they developed. And what Aristotle has done in the Posterior Analytics is come up with an alternative to Plato's view about the nature and source of knowledge that will be very attractive to many people going forward, but also very problematic. Basically, all of science is committed to empiricism in some way or other. Unfortunately, what we're going to see with the authors we read later, Descartes and Hume, is that empiricism faces some really troubling problems. All right, this has been a long video. It's not going to be the last Aristotle video, but it will be the last video on the Posterior Analytics.